To another weekly meetup. So I have a few topics that I wanted to go over at this meeting. Specifically one that's somewhat controversial, but it's not a final decision by any means because in the end the community will always be the one to makes these kind of decisions. So it will require a coin vote. So more or less, what it boils down to is after doing some research, we found that it's possible or at least at this point in time, it seems possible to us that the blockchain EOS could be used as our base layer for Novusphere, and we wouldn't actually need to build our own blockchain. Now, this was actually a kind of surprising discovery because when we initially set out to do this project, and I had done the research on the existing projects at the time, the biggest smart contract platform at the time was Ethereum, and there were a few other smart contract platforms like Lisk. And then, of course, you have other platforms that do have some quote unquote smart functionality, like NXT and Waves, but they don't have programmable functionality. So in the case of, let's say, Novusphere as it was currently planned, Novusphere as it's currently planned was to have smart functionality that's very specific to what our tasks are, so it would be implemented in a similar way to how NXT and Waves functions. So anyways, going back to my point about smart contracts, so I had done an extensive look at existing blockchains, and none really satisfied the needs that we needed for Novusphere to work. And so there are two major needs that we have. So the first is the capacity in terms of on-chain transactions for a proper ecosystem, and the other major thing that we need is how the actual economic model of Novusphere works. So with almost every blockchain, it works off of a fee model. So everyone should be fairly familiar with this. On Bitcoin, you send a transaction, you pay a fee. On Ethereum, you send a transaction, you pay a fee. On Ethereum, you call a smart contract function. For example, when you transfer an ERC20 token, you're actually calling a smart contract function transfer. You pay a fee. So the fee is always paid by the user. So even in a system, for example, we see Memo.cash recently built on Bitcoin Cash. Um, Very cool in terms of what it does. The problem is you pay a fee. And even if Bitcoin Cash could redesign itself to look like Twitter, feel like Twitter, nobody would use a Twitter where you pay every time you do an action because nobody likes to lose money. It feels bad. Not only that, but the value of money is very different to people. So $1 to a US citizen is very different to $1 to someone, say, in India or anywhere in the second world or in the third world for that matter. So because of this, even though, let's say, Bitcoin Cash might flaunt fees of a fraction of a cent, we don't know if it'll stay that way, and this poses a problem. That's why the blockchain, or that blockchain model, is not really very good in terms of the economic model to build these kind of platforms. So let's tackle a few things as to what the pros and cons of what building on EOS is. And forward disclaimer, I'm sort of skipping over giving a intro to EOS. I figure that most of you guys have at least heard of it, assuming you stay up to date with a lot of the big blockchain projects that are going on in the space. So I think one of the first things to talk about is what changes in terms of the economic model of Novusphere. And Unicron, feel free to step in case you think I miss anything or if I misspeak about something. So in terms of the economic model of Novusphere, um, I don't really think too much actually changes if we were to build it as an EOS application. And so what I mean by that is, um, instead of block producers, so let's break down the hierarchy of like what actually happens in the Novusphere ecosystem. Um, So one of the first things that we need to look at is the block producers and the block producers being voted in and being rewarded. So in this case, if we were to build as DApp on EOS, there are no block producers. However, we can substitute this role in terms of the board members or the block producers, the delegates, whatever you want to call them. We can say that this role is now to run public gateways. So this actually is, it's not a pro or a con, right? Because we get a different aspect out of it. So in the old system, we couldn't incentivize people to run a public gateway just because, let's say, you were a block producer, unless we introduced an extra inflation mechanism. But let's say you were a block producer, um, this doesn't necessarily imply that you are running a public gateway. And likewise, you might be a really good block producer in terms of having a beefy hardware setup, but not want to run a public gateway. So in this system in the DApp, we actually incentivize a few people to run public gateways that any user can use. So the first thing that you might think of is, why would we want more than one public gateway? So for example, Steemit, to my knowledge, functions off of just one public gateway, and this works fine for the most part. Um, So, or are there alternative, like links other than just steemit.com? Maybe Unicron went on this one. But, um, so in terms of public gateways, there's two advantages I can think of that we get out of this, which is, um, we get more resistance in terms of, let's say, someone trying to knock down a public gateway via an attack, let's say a DDoS or whatever. They have to take down more public gateways, so that's more expended resources from an attacker. But I think the more interesting aspect that this introduces when we have more people running public gateways is we end up having Novusphere nodes running in multiple legal jurisdictions. So what I mean by that is, obviously each person who runs a public gateway should be doing it in a way that's compliant with whatever the legal standards are where they live. But we do know that the legal standards from different countries vary greatly. For example, how copyright laws are handled, let's say, in certain countries like the US versus, let's say, how they're handled in China. So I think having public gateways spread out could actually be really good for the project for those two reasons. So another point to really tackle is, I guess this more so relates to the FUD relating around EOS. So a lot of people will say, well, I guess maybe it's not just EOS, it's DPoS in general, delegated proof of stake, which is, there's a lot of people, especially from the Ethereum crowd, who may or may not feel threatened by EOS, who will say, it's centralized. And I don't agree with that, and I don't think Unicron agrees with that either. Especially when you look at how the delegate system works in comparison to how mining pools work, and how much of Ethereum's mining pools are just actually concentrated into two pools. I think that makes up actually the bulk of Ethereum's mining power, and with Bitcoin it's maybe like, what, 8 or 10 pools? So it's really not that different. Um, so arguably, DPoS chains are more decentralized. But let's say, for sake of example, that it is centralized. Just let's do an exercise. So the thing is that even if it was centralized, the first thing to note is, as a DApp, we do not have um, liability over what is in the DApp, first of all. So let's say the blockchain was centralized, and they started censoring transactions relating to our DApp being Novusphere. This is a really good way to shoot yourself in the foot in terms of your blockchain project, right? Can you imagine, like, the headlines, EOS is censoring transactions? And, this is a really good way to prove that you're not decentralized, is to start censoring transactions. So I can't really see them doing this. So even if you were to say it was centralized, specifically because of the fact that we still get the immutability, we still get the censorship resistance, it really wouldn't matter. But my main point, though, is it's not centralized. But even if we say that it is, we still get what we need out of it, and that's what matters. So another aspect is the high performance aspect of it. So of course EOS is a delegated proof of stake blockchain, and I know for a fact that Dan has been building that blockchain based on what I've read in the white paper as well, with parallelization in mind in terms of how transactions are handled. So typically on a lot of blockchains, when you do validation, it's only handled with a single thread. So not to get too technical here, but more or less you're looking at maybe something around like 5,000 to 10,000 transactions, like a second, if you're only processing on a single thread, and that's under optimal conditions. So optimal conditions being like a very small amount of like block producers. But if that could be parallelized, you could have multiple threads doing validation, and then we start to get to the goal that EOS has, as well as the other graphene and DPoS-based blockchains that Dan has developed, um, aiming more towards the whole 1 million transactions per second. But we do know already that EOS is not going to be handling that from the get-go. I think Unicron gave me an estimate of around 5,000 off EOS's initial launch, which sounds more or less right with the estimate that I gave earlier.
Yeah, it's about 3,000 or something early tests, but it's hard to say right now.
Right. So another really important thing to point out is the inherited security model of this. So what I mean by that is when you roll your own blockchain, you are subjugating yourself to be attacked, obviously. And even if you use another blockchain's source code, and it has been attacked, then that doesn't necessarily mean your blockchain won't be attacked. So, for example, um, I know there have been projects that have forked Lisk in the past that have been attacked because they have very poor distribution, and then you can cause some havoc in terms of the blockchain. And just for example, because proof of work works fine on Bitcoin doesn't mean that somebody else isn't going to get 51% on a smaller chain and then start doing some naughty double spending attacks. So just because a consensus mechanism works on one chain does not mean it'll work on the other, especially if the other is a lot smaller in terms of the chain. So using EOS here lets us inherit their security model. If EOS is secure, it means a Novusphere is secure in terms of how it can be attacked at a blockchain level. So this is a really good aspect here because it means that we as Novusphere have to do far less code auditing related to the blockchain, and instead we're inheriting EOS's auditing and EOS's security in that aspect, which obviously they have a greater budget in that aspect and a lot more people working on that. So I think that's a really big pro, and I want to stress that specifically because of the inherited security model of using an existing blockchain, it speeds up the development time of Novusphere a lot. So this is a really important factor here to deal with the pros of why EOS could be used. Um, so another question, I guess that one of the obvious questions that get raised is, okay, well, how does self-hosting work if you run on EOS? Um, so we can have two configuration modes for how Novusphere nodes work because there still are going to be Novusphere nodes that you do run on your computer if you want to access content locally. If you don't want to access content locally, then you actually don't need to run anything on your computer because um, everything just sort of works out. You can use the public gateway, which will connect, to a public Novusphere node as well. So the Novusphere node would have two modes of running, which is you could pair it as well against a locally ran EOS node, which would basically be the optimal security model. So this would be like kind of imagine you're running Electrum and you're also running Bitcoin Core and you're running an Electrum server pointed at your Bitcoin Core. So you're not relying on other Electrum servers. So you have the highest like privacy that you can get out of Electrum in that sense because your data is not leaking through a third-party server. So in this case, that would be the best security setup you could have is run your own Novusphere node, run your own EOS node. But obviously, running an EOS node is probably going to be very bulky in terms of what you need. So the lighter setup to that would be to just run a Novusphere node and point it to an EOS node. And as I said before, we can assume that the EOS blockchain is very unlikely to be censored, so we don't really lose anything significant in terms of security by doing this. So, what the Novusphere node that you are running locally actually does is it builds the database index based on the data in the DApp, and then from that database index, you are able to access the content locally and use the local UI on your own computer without depending on a third party other than the third party EOS node. So not really much changes in terms of self-hosting. You still have censorship resistance. You can still avoid using a public gateway if you want, and not all that much changes. So more or less, like briefly summarizing, the economic model stays the same. Well, actually, let's go back to the economic model. Everything else stays the same except for the whole block producers thing. Instead of block producers, we replace that with the role of running a public gateway, which maybe we don't feel that's as important of a task as a block producer, so we might factor that into inflation a little differently. But more or less everything stays the exact same. There will still be judges to handle how bounties are handled. There will still be a staking mechanism where you do have to stake slash vest your Atmos to have a voting weight. There will still be a paid inflation to people who are staking their Atmos. There will be a paid inflation to people who are voted to run public gateways, and there will be paid inflation to a DAO. And likewise, voting in the DAO to release funds, etc., works pretty much the same. So the economic model doesn't change too much. We keep censorship resistance, which is one of the very important factors of how this application needs to work. And we have high performance and inherent security model. But let me get to, I guess I sort of should have covered this one first. Let me get to the actual main point as to why EOS works and Ethereum doesn't. So this is something that goes, I think, overlooked in terms of a lot of the people who support Ethereum, because Ethereum has been getting compared to EOS since it's pretty much been announced. EOS presents an alternative to the economic model of how a blockchain works. It works off of a similar model to Steam, where you have bandwidth allocated to you, bandwidth being the resources in terms of how many transactions you do or how much storage space you take up in terms of the blockchain. So the way this actually differs from Ethereum, and why it allows us to be able to build on EOS and not on Ethereum is because of the fact when you build an application on EOS or a contract, the developer of the contract can have staked funds or staked EOS, which gives him access to resources and storage, and he can actually divert that to the contract. So what that means is the people using the contract have a subsidy, essentially. They have access to more resources than they normally would if they are using the contract. So because of that, it can make using the application a lot more friendly. It doesn't require the user to actually have a large amount of EOS for pretty much any at all, to my understanding. What it does still require, though, and this is something Unicron pointed out, which arguably can be both a pro and a con, is it does require them to still set up an EOS account. But I'm going to assume that's a fairly painless process. Assuming you've used Steam, it's not exactly too difficult to register a Steam account. So having an EOS account would be required, but the point is that users don't need to pay for every action that they do on the blockchain, and we can subsidize those actions so that they're able to do more actions than they normally would, using development funds pointed at the contract. So I think that mainly sums up the pros for EOS. Maybe you can go over some of those cons that you mentioned on Unicron.
Oh yeah, I made like a little table of pros and cons. Can you guys hear me? My volume?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I guess yeah, I'll quickly go over the table of pros and cons if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So one of them.
maybe you can share it in the chat if you have it written out or something.
Oh no, I just with a pen.
Okay,
So
no problem.
one of the first things is that the latency for EOS is quite fast. They have basically half-second block times, or actually it's half. Forget exact number for that, but basically the latency is how fast they can send a transaction and somebody can send a response back. So you can imagine for using an app, it'd be extremely seamless. Uh, Even 3 seconds is already like feeling quite fast because it's 1.5 latency. That's a dog. That's cool. Yes, like Asphyxia said, yeah, like Asphyxia said, the security will be handled for them, and they have a lot of people working on it, and they can handle a lot of the polish that's necessary for securing the network. But at the same time, there's a lot of DPoS code out there that's very useful for writing a copy of it. The standard token could be useful because to get added to more exchanges, it helps for the exchanges not to have to like learn a whole new structure or something, or a whole new client. It'd be just part of the EOS client. Then EOS also offers this thing called sidechains, which doesn't have much literature. I'll paste the image that I found describing it. One sec.
So just to go over a quick point that Unicron made that I actually forgot is what he's saying is as a token on EOS, it's very similar to how we have tokens on Ethereum. Um, blockchain, or sorry, not blockchains, exchanges are actually having easier time adding us to the exchange because it means that it's far less for them to audit because it's not as if they need to run any new software on their computer to be able, or their setups to be able to add us to the exchange, so they don't have to really do a whole lot of auditing on their part.
Yeah, exactly. I'm I'm struggling right now to quite get grasp the sidechain tech that they're proposing because I don't think it's yet polished or done. But that's something to consider in the future. The no fees, of course, is very nice for upvoting, downvoting, you know, polishing the sorting mechanism, making it as seamless as possible. Then the last thing was that the full nodes, according to them, can be only scanning the apps or the accounts they care about, and that's kind of something that the creator of it, Dan or whatever, he's always been very passionate about nodes being able to validate without having to validate every other useless app that people don't care about, and doing all kinds of tricks with how they register the transactions on the chain to allow to do that. But at the same time, again, EOS is not done yet completely. So that leads me to the cons panel, which is the design is quickly changing, to different values. It's always in flux, and designing it right, coding it right now could be constantly having to go back and change things pretty significantly, and maybe something could be completely game breaking. Who knows? You could have a lot of issues since it's so new, and right now it's not out yet, and when it is out, it's could be problematic. It could be early bugs and so on, overflow errors. Who knows? At the same time, they do have like 2 billion in funding, so that's a positive, I guess, to polish those errors. Uh, if you wanted to change something on the blockchain to make our job easier, like changing blockchain parameters, maybe slowing it down, speeding it up, changing something else, uh, we wouldn't have as much control over it because we'd be limited by whatever the platform decides. So it'd be connected to the success, or I guess how the platform works, versus being able to change it ourselves. Uh, and then, yeah, I guess it's again like the attack surface of EOS is unknown. We don't know a lot about it, and even though I guess DPoS has been running since 2014, live pretty much, and at least two plus chains. Uh, each iteration is different, and we have to always consider, I guess. I mean, ideally, I'd like to build on Bitcoin if possible, and if it was fast enough, it was cheap enough, just because it has the longest amount of time running, and there's a lot of work put into minimizing the attack surface, so that we don't have to worry about various issues. Yeah, RSK might work, might not. It's hard to tell right now. They have a federated sidechain right now, and I'm not sure they'll adapt what is it called? The Truth Coins guy. I forgot his name. Drive chain to attach to RSK. So I'm not entirely sure how successful it's going to be yet. And same thing with EOS. It's not out yet as well completely, and a lot of the specs are not out. Yeah, and the fee model, of course. I guess I was saying is that maybe there could be like a different sidechain to something else like EOS, but it's too early to say right now, regardless. So I was going to propose that we keep going with the the current development, but also uh, work at least partially. At least somebody works on the app development, and if it looks like it's far enough, while we already tested a lot of the logic that goes into contracts, bounties, and so on, maybe we transfer to the EOS later after a vote. But I think it's a little early to work to completely devote ourselves to work on a very hypothetical, not I don't know hypothetical, but very rapidly uncertain, rapidly changing uncertain network. That's all I have to say.
So I think what I want a few things that I wanted to add. Part of my suggestion and proposal was not exactly to drop everything and say, okay, let's go build on US, because obviously there's going to be time for the community to either decide that we believe as a community that we should be building on EOS, or we believe that we should continue with the status quo. Um, the two things to point out here is status quo obviously does have a longer development timeline in terms of how long it takes to actually produce the final product versus EOS. But um, what I think the best move for us to do is, in the process of allowing the plain vote to happen, um, I can make a pivot from what I'm working on right now, which is right now I've been working on mainly the blockchain layer of the project in terms of Novusphere. I can make a pivot to working on the um, the application layer. So the application layer is the Novusphere node that people would be running on their computers. So if you want to think about it in the first case scenario, in the, in the first case scenario, yeah, I muted him. You can message me, Tabs, if you want me to unmute you if you've already muted yourself. Um, in the first case scenario, you can think about it as a person would be running both the Novusphere node, so the node being like, well, I guess it can be 2 in 1 in this case. So, but we can separate it, right? So we can separate application layer from blockchain. And in the EOS case, we separate it. Even in this case, we can separate it, and it really wouldn't make much of a difference. So the application layer is really what gives people access to the content that's in the blockchain and how that's handled. So the nice thing about an application layer is, so once that's built, it could be plugged into um, any any type of blockchain. So for example, as a hypothetical, once the application layer is designed, if for whatever reason, let's say we wanted to do a blockchain layer that interface with something like Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash or Ethereum, we could do that. Or we could do a blockchain layer that interfaces with EOS, or we could do a blockchain layer that's actually just our own thing, which is currently what status quo is right now. So I think the focus needs to pivot here, at least at this time, while the vote happens, to allow for me to work on the application layer instead of the blockchain layer, so we can sort of decide, do we want to continue pursuing developing the blockchain layer versus, let's say, building on EOS. And I guess the major things that we've considered is, what do we really get out of building our own blockchain layer instead of just building on EOS. And as Unicron pointed out, the main thing that we do get is we get tighter control over a lot of the finer details of the underlying blockchain. But the trade-off to that is we don't get necessarily the same security model as some of the bigger blockchains do, and we can't exactly piggyback off of it in the same way. The security model not only being how the blockchain can be attacked, but the security model also being how well that blockchain has been audited and who it's been audited by and the resources that have been put into auditing that contract, or sorry, auditing that blockchain to try to attack it. So these are all things that need to be taken into consideration here. So I think I should expand a little more on what I mean by the application layer. So let's say I work on this application layer and I have it done, let's say a month or two, assuming that's how long we run the vote for. I believe EOS is planning on launching in like June. Um, well, okay, yeah, hang on. I'll reply to what you like Unicron. So I think a 2-month timeline to allow for the vote might be a little rushed, maybe 2 or 3 months. I don't really know, but I don't think the application layer will take 2 months, or sorry, I don't think it'll take 3 months. So uh, that's definitely something that we need to consider. But the application layer is at least something I would be able to give to developers, like let's say Code Blue, and he would be able to run the application layer on his computer, start building his application for it, and pretty much when the blockchain layer is plugged into it, nothing would need to change in terms of his code. Everything would work. So that does actually allow other developers that are interested in our project to continue to work on it and continue building on it. I still think that we should do a vote, but I can't see really many people, at least in my opinion, being too against the idea of building on EOS. Mainly for, like I said, the security model aspect, but also from the fact that we benefit a lot from joining a bigger community in this aspect, right? Because it introduces a lot of, it sort of piggybacks our community onto theirs. Yes, the vote would be weighted off of the number of coins you have. Um, and so, yeah, so that's a big plus, right? So by building it as an application on EOS, you expose yourself to a bigger audience, especially like right off the bat, in terms of people that'll be willing to come and try your application, as opposed to being a completely separate project. Um, People are very hostile when it comes to blockchain projects. It's like, if you're your own separate project, everyone, feels you're a competitor. Well, okay, maybe like the developers of the other blockchain don't feel you're a competitor, but like the communities are very tribalistic. Um, Whereas like none of the Ethereum, um, projects like let's say, BAT, nobody's saying, Brave is going to replace Ethereum, right? So when you build on another platform, you sort of, interrupt into their community. Um, Now, in regards to what Unicron said, yeah, that is a third option that we have considered, which is the let's say we like their code base, and we decided, okay, let's just take their code base and we can continue taking their updates, and we can just sort of replace let's say EOS with Atmos. In this case, if we were to do that, I'm just saying it as a hypothetical. The problem is keeping up to date with backporting everything, as well as any changes that we've made. And so what I mean by that is, if you look at, for example, in the Bitcoin world, Bitcoin Unlimited, which was a fork from Bitcoin Core, maybe I think 12 or 11. Holy, they've fallen so far behind. Like in terms of maybe it's like an even like further version. They've fallen very far behind in terms of keeping up to date with what's in core and all the security patches that have came out in core. Like Bitcoin Unlimited doesn't even have like SegWit right now, so it's like you almost have like zero incentive to use it. So I don't really know if forking a code base and trying to keep up to date with it is a great idea. Maybe if like there was someone who's like their entire job was just to backport the updates, like it might be viable, but yeah, it's I don't think it's the most optimal idea. It's possible, but I don't think it's the most optimal. So did I miss something? Oh, okay, here we go. So I think that pretty much covers a lot of what we have to say about EOS. I know Code Blue wanted to give an update on his project that he's been working on. But if anyone has any questions pertaining to the whole potentially building on EOS thing, now's a good time to ask. Especially if you have any concerns.
So, guys, I was just wondering, in terms of how the testnet development has been going, what does that change if you're going to pivot towards the application layer? Does that mean that we don't work on the testnet stuff for the time being, or in terms of just the sort of roadmap that's been kind of laid out over the last few weeks?
Yeah, so this would be definitely a drastic change in terms of the roadmap because it's a change in priorities, right? So the testnet is basically the blockchain layer of the project. And you, like I said, you can split it into two components, which is the application layer and the blockchain layer. So, yeah, in this case we would temporarily halt working on the Novusphere testnet, and instead we would basically we'd halt working on the blockchain layer and we'd just start working on the application layer. And this isn't really a loss in terms of productivity towards the project because we're still working on something that would need to get done inevitably, but it is a shift in terms of priorities because prior to this, or prior to needing to call this type of a coin vote, the priority would have been building on the blockchain layer, whereas now the priority becomes building the application layer because there's uncertainty about what the blockchain layer actually is. So does that help clarify your question?
Yeah, no, that does. I mean, that's what I assumed, but I was just making sure that I was understanding it correctly.
Yeah, so again, just to like emphasize on this, once the application layer is designed, it is possible, like I said, to build different blockchain layers and redeploy Novusphere on different blockchains. Um, so you could you could have one that, let's say, runs on Ethereum or Bitcoin Cash. It's just you would have the fees along for the ride, and you wouldn't be able to do anything about that because that's just how the underlying blockchain works. So I don't really know why anyone would do that, but I'm just saying like that is a possibility. So the blockchain layer is very interoperable with this design. Like it can be swapped out to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of EOS, so I mean, to me, it was definitely always a question of why not look at it as an option. I just wasn't sure, what the needs of the Novusphere blockchain would have, so whether or not any other blockchain would, function. So I'm definitely interested in having this explored.
Yeah. So my suggestion was, just to clarify it again, was the new priority becomes the application layer, which is still a part of our project. It needs to get done no matter what, and this gives time for a coin vote to occur to sort of see and gauge the community's opinion on whether this is a good idea or not. Regarding what you said, the demands for Novusphere are, I'll post a short summary that I actually posted in the whale chat as to what I think it boils down to. But I think the main aspect that ruled out a lot of the other blockchains was really that fee model, because I don't think there's really any other blockchains that allow you to subsidize the fees in such a way where you're not spending money to do transactions, and you are also allowed to subsidize fees for users of your application. Like even on Ethereum, when they deploy a DApp, like let's say a decentralized exchange, on Ethereum, you still have to pay fees for every transaction that you do. When you place an order, that's a fee. When you cancel an order, that's a fee. And that was a problem in BitShares. I remember like people did not like this. Right? People hated having to pay fees to cancel orders. So So I might not be able to answer like all your questions regarding EOS. I actually think Unicron probably knows more about EOS in terms of general information than I do. But yeah, I can definitely help answer concerns in regards to what projects are or what blockchains are viable and why or why not they are viable. So.
In terms of the economic model and voting and all that aspect, so since we wouldn't be voting for block producers any longer, what would be the sort of stake? Like, how would the staking mechanism actually work? It would just be essentially putting your coins into a hold.
Yeah, okay, so technically you are still, in a sense, staking, right? Your coins would become unspendable. They become vested in the contract would handle this, right? It's no different than if a blockchain makes your coins unspendable versus if, let's say, the contract that's holding your coins makes them unspendable. So in this case, you still vest your coins to basically have a stake, and then you can use that stake to vote for various things. So, for example, you vote for who, people being running the public gateways. You'd vote for, judges to handle the bounty system. You could also vote for content, so that's like upvoting, downvoting. And that sort of thing. So there's still a staking system mechanism in place there's a governance system in place essentially that relies on the Atmos token. So this isn't something I guess I didn't put an emphasis on when I sort of talked about this at this meeting, but I did put an emphasis on it when I talked about it in the whale chat is even with this design of building on EOS, Atmos does not suffer from the design that I critique a lot in Ethereum, which is you have a token that's along for the ride. A lot of projects in Ethereum have this problem where you have to ask yourself, why does the token exist, right? What does this token actually do for me? And a lot of projects don't really have a good answer to that. It's sort of along for the ride, and it really only exists because that project did a crowdfund. So and they needed to give something back to the participants of that crowdfund. So in this case, Atmos still needs to exist. Like no matter what, it's still a fundamental part of our governance. It's still part of electing the public gateways, the judges, the upvoting and downvoting, handling content, and that sort of thing. And of course, there would still be the same inflation schedule. So the economic model, as I said, doesn't really change that much. The only thing that changes, instead of electing block producers, you elect people to run public gateways. And the nice part about that is you're going to end up possibly with multiple public gateways in different jurisdictions, just different legal jurisdictions. So yeah, if anyone has any other questions, I mean, feel free to shoot.
Don't be shy.
Okay, well, I guess if anyone has any questions, they can follow up in the chat. I can reply to them there. And I can turn it over to Code Blue to give us an update on what he's been doing.
Someone's watching TV in the background, so I don't know if you guys can hear that. If it's too bad, then I can just type, whatever. But basically, I started adding some more filtering functions on the search by the letter. I guess the first letter, there's the pagination for when there's a lot more like content. So I don't know how many like shows we want to show on the list, but anyway, that's just for scaling purposes. And then if you go into the content page, there's the episode list, and then I added a submit new episode button. I guess it's just I'm working on being able to submit the metadata for the episodes. And then on the newly added tab, there's also a list of shows with the fields being filterable. I guess it's just the like alphanumerical filter. And then there's also submitting a new series for adding a new series. A lot of the data, like a lot of the fields for these forms are not complete. I just started adding it. And then I guess that's about it. I can't think of much else, but yeah.
Yeah, it looks good so far. It's definitely coming along. So once I can actually, once the application layer is actually finished, and you actually have the application layer and you're able to run it on your own, you would actually be able to plug in all of the API that you would need to add content and sort of manage the content that your web interface would be, correct? So once the application layer is actually done for the project, you sort of have a final API to work with, and you would be able to build your project without worrying about what happens in terms of the underlying blockchain decision. So I
Right,
think
yeah.
that's actually really good for developers that are trying to right now, such as yourself, to build stuff on the platform.
Yeah, I mean, if the application layer is not done, then I can't really implement any of the calls and stuff. So.
Yeah, right now I can see from what you have, obviously all of this stuff is temporary. None of this stuff is really in a database or anything like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's coming along. Pretty cool. Thanks for keeping us up to date.
No problem.
So yeah, if anyone has anything they want to talk about at this meeting, you're more than welcome to. Floor is yours. If anyone wants to ask any other questions relating to our current proposal of potentially building on EOS, good time to ask, or if anyone wants to ask Code Blue about anything in regarding to what he's doing. Too bad Lutz is not in the chat. I know he'd ask you if you're willing to build a porn interface for him. But yeah.
That's not exactly difficult. It's just some metadata.
So, what's the process of like becoming a DApp on EOS? Like, have they worked that out yet?
Yeah, so you can already deploy dApps on EOS on their, well, not on their mainnet. Obviously, you can run testnet. There's not a public testnet, but you can run your own testnet. Actually, you know what? I want to bring this up because this is maybe something a lot of people overlooked. A lot of people laughed when Amazon came out with the whole Ethereum template thing. Run your own private Ethereum blockchain on Amazon. Why would I ever want to do that? The reason you would want to do that is it's mainly for sandbox testing. You would never actually do it to like run a real blockchain, but it gives you access to a little better testing environment than if you were running on a public testnet, because you don't actually have to wait for blocks to be mined, which can be a pain in terms of the Ethereum blockchain. And I assume like other blockchains might suffer from a similar problem in terms of like lag as to how fast blocks are being mined. But yeah. So anyways, going back to the EOS thing. They use WebAssembly to deploy their contracts. So WebAssembly is something really new that's been growing in terms of how internet browsers can handle things. So it's pretty interesting how they've handled that. I'm personally actually not as much of a fan as to how EOS contracts are written at this time as I am to how Ethereum contracts are written. I think Ethereum has a much more elegant approach to this. That's not to say that EOS's approach to it is particularly bad. It more so has to just do with programming preference, if anything. So I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe you can repeat it. I think I've gone off topic a bit. Here,
No, that does. I mean, I guess what I was wondering is if we get the application layer and we're not ready to hey, let's deploy this, we could. I mean, I guess is it possible to test stuff using whatever's available on the EOS testnet?
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll actually link you to an example of one of an EOS contract, and you can take a look at it. It's one of the ones that I took a look at. So Here's one of them. It's a very simple dice game that's built on EOS as a contract. So you can already write contracts on EOS and test them on your own. So yeah, if we finish the application layer and the community did decide, okay, let's go with EOS, the next thing that we would begin doing is working on developing the smart contract code to deploy on EOS.
I see. Well, that's cool. So we're I mean, while you're doing what you're doing in terms of the pivot towards the application layer, will you be looking at what that deployment looks like to make sure that there's nothing that you're not aware of? Or I mean, is that something you have to research, or is it something that's really obvious?
So at this time, it seems like everything you basically, so right now EOS is their smart contracts are being written in C++. So it seems more or less we have access to all the heavy lifting that we need to like make the underlying system of Novusphere, the DApp. So at this time, I'm fairly confident that everything can be built into the contract. But as Unicron said, things are changing, and there are other languages that are being looked at in terms of being able to compile to WebAssembly. Because the way EOS contracts works is you write it in C++, and then you compile it to the WebAssembly format, and then you push to EOS the WebAssembly file. So, if, for example, you create a compiler for, let's say, Python, as he said, that compiles down to WebAssembly, then you can use Python also to write contracts on EOS. So, at this time, from what I understand, EOS's contract system, though, as C++ does have all the requirements that we would need to build the system. I guess Lutz isn't in this chat, so I will reply to him in the chat.
I was going to give an update about the white paper. I guess we're in draft version 2 now. I sent it to Asphyxia yesterday or 2 days ago. So that's coming along well, I think. And yeah, I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah, so we can actually look to release. Well, I was looking to that to the community pretty soon, but given this pivot thing, just one moment. Let me just actually reply to this. Yeah, so given this whole pivot thing, I think it might be worth it to take the time to add in or refactor, sort of some parts of what we've written to consider the whole EOS aspect of it and sort of detail how things would work if they are built on EOS as opposed to running our own blockchain layer. So we can look to share that with the community this week, but what that does mean, again, just to follow up on what was said last week, it means that we're not launching the thread today, and we're not launching a final white paper right away, because we're going to basically have ambiguity of, are we building on EOS or are we not? And depending on that, that's sort of what'll dictate the final white paper. But we can share the draft with the community so they can sort of see where things are currently at. So yeah, if anyone has any other questions or any topics they want to talk about, that would be a great time. It doesn't necessarily need to be related to Novusphere. It could be another cool crypto project that you're interested in. Okay, well, I guess that's it then for this meeting. Thanks for attending, guys, and I guess I'll see you again next week. And we're gonna look to start the coin vote probably I want to say on Wednesday. I can't give a definite timeline of how long it's going to last. I would estimate it to be at least at minimum 1 month, but very likely more closer to like 2.5. I'm going to write a blog post detailing everything that was talked about in this meeting. So you'll have it all in textual format. It'll sort of give the summary of the points that I made in terms of the pros for EOS, as well as the pros and cons that Unicron talked about in terms of EOS. So the community has an idea of what the pros and cons are of this approach is. So, yeah, thanks guys for attending, and look forward to that blog post. I'll probably have it out on Monday or Tuesday. Blog post will come out before the coin vote starts. Alright, thanks again. Take care, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.